Now, in late April, as Fred mentioned, the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth took place in Cochabamba, Bolivia. Unlike the Copenhagen Climate Summit last December, this conference wasn't led by the rich imperialist countries, the polluters responsible for climate change and environmental disaster, but by the impoverished and developing countries, the indigenous peoples, and the workers and oppressed who bear the brunt of the ecological devastation due to global warming and environmental racism. In Copenhagen, it was the imperialists who ruled the day, who destroyed the mandates of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which the United States never signed on to. And they turned that legally binding agreement for countries to set goals to lower their carbon dioxide emissions into something voluntary. And like everything else under capitalism, even lowering greenhouse gas emission levels has turned into a commodity that can be bought and sold on the market. Comrades and friends have heard the term cap and trade. You know, a corporation gets so many, points that they're allowed to pollute. And if they need more, they buy them from another corporation that has, some to spare. Well, the countries that were shut out of the Copenhagen talks are the very countries who suffer the worst effects from environmental degradation caused by global warming. And while the rich countries caused the problem, the poor and developing countries, which have had little to no impact at all in causing the crisis, are the ones suffering. And because of this, the governments of Bolivia and Nicaragua and Venezuela and a few others have called for climate reparations from the imperialist countries. And just to give a couple examples of this inequality, one of the demands that was made by Bolivian President Evo Morales at the People's Conference on Climate Change was to really target the biggest polluters for their increased carbon dioxide emissions. And specifically, there was a demand put forward that the developed countries donate a minimum of 1% of their annual gross domestic product to a United Nations fund for poorer countries. See, as the polluting countries are very wealthy, the United Nations has found that the number of victims of weather disasters in developing countries caused by climate change has more than tripled between 1980 and 2004. Over 250 million people around the world suffer because of these weather-related, climate change-related disasters. According to projections by the National Academy of Sciences, developed countries, meaning imperialist countries, carbon dioxide emissions will cost the developing countries more than $2.3 trillion in damages during the next century. But the 43 poorest nations, or low-income economies as they're called, have a combined gross domestic product of only $569 billion in 2008. That's less than 25% of the projected cost for the damages just for this ecological destruction alone. So you can see where the imperialist countries have caused the most damage in terms of destruction of the environment caused by carbon dioxide emissions and the climate change due to the depletion of the ozone. but it's the developing countries who are being asked to pay for this. Now, bear with me 1 second. I want to read a few words that Comrade Hugo Chavez had to say when he spoke in Copenhagen. And unlike what Obama had to say and the other leaders of the imperialist countries, Chavez got up there and what's the phrase? He spoke truth to power. He stated, one could say that a specter is haunting Copenhagen, to paraphrase Karl Marx, the great Karl Marx. A specter is haunting the streets of Copenhagen, and I think that specter walks silently through this room. He's addressing the body. Walking among us, through the halls, out below, it rises. This specter is a terrible specter almost nobody wants to mention. Capitalism is the specter. It's capitalism the people roar out there. Hear them. He was referencing the tens of thousands of people who were in the streets in London demonstrating. Excuse me, Copenhagen. He said, I've been reading some of the slogans painted on the streets and the slogans of these youngsters. You can hear, among others, two powerful slogans. One, don't change the climate, change the system. And I take it on board for us. Let's not change the climate, let's change the system. And consequently, we will begin to save the planet. Capitalism is a destructive development model that is putting an end to life. It threatens to put a definitive end to the human species. And another slogan calls for reflection, he said. It is very in tune with the banking crisis that swept the world and still affects it, and of how the rich northern countries gave aid to bankers and the big banks. The U.S. alone gave, well, I don't have the figure, but it's astronomical to save the banks. They say in the streets the following: if the climate were a bank, it would have been saved already. Isn't that true?